Good afternoon again from Scotland, good morning in North America, and welcome to this event from the Asia Scotland Institute. My name is Martin Perbrick, I'm the Institute Director. Our focus today is a presentation and discussion of the recent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that dominated more than a decade of international politics and are unsettled today. I think it's important to say recent wars because obviously, certainly my country has had a history of military conflict in both of those countries. In fact, my father was in Basra in World War II, and I'm sure there are many people here, many other people here whose family have been in that part of the world. But the recent wars have been most contentious, most divisive, and also have many lessons to learn, and are not yet ended, which is a major problem. So to open this event, we'll have an overview of both wars from Brigadier Ben Barry, whose book, Blood, Metal and Dust, is the first military history to offer a comprehensive overview of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq in the 21st century, providing in-depth accounts of the operations by US, UK forces and other multinational forces of their allies. Brigadier Barry analyses the wars, which in a way have shaped how the Middle East is now, unsettled obviously, and provides a huge overview, a detailed narrative of the operations, many of the issues and areas that went wrong, and also pulls no punches regarding accountability for some of the failures in Iraq and Afghanistan. And we'll come on to that later with the questions, obviously. If you've not read Brigadier Barry's book, then I highly recommend that you do, as it really is one of the most insightful overviews of what went wrong in both wars. And I think trying to be positive as well, what worked. I think Brigadier Barry's highlighted how some very talented military leaders coming through middle and senior levels revised their strategies during both wars and really saved the situations from being worse than they could have been perhaps in some ways. And I think Brigadier Barry is uniquely placed to tell the story of these conflicts and offer a rounded account of the campaigns in relation to the geopolitical landscape. Just to go through his experience a little, he joined the British Army in, let's say, the mid-1970s, Ben, I won't give the exact year. As usual with career army officers, served all over the world, Germany, France, Cyprus, Canada, Portugal, New Zealand, etc. Hong Kong, where I came from, which I think was a bit of a holiday posting, Ben, and Northern Ireland, which was not a holiday posting, obviously. He commanded an infantry battalion and a multinational brigade on UN and NATO operations in Bosnia. Obviously a troubled conflict in itself. Ben was director of the British Army Staff in the UK Ministry of Defence and author of the British Army's Lessons Learned analysis of post-conflict stabilisation in Iraq. From 2010, he joined the International Institute for Strategic Studies. And he's also a visiting professor at the Department of War Studies at King's College London. He's published multiple books about Iraq, Afghanistan, and also Bosnia, which I'd highly recommend. So obviously Ben is talking about the wars, the outcome, the lessons learned. What we really also need to talk about is how the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq end. And to help discuss this, we have Vanda Felbab-Brown of the Centre for Security Strategy and Technology in the Foreign Policy Programme at the Brookings Institute. And Vanda also has extremely broad experience with international conflicts, non-traditional security threats, including insurgency, organised crime, urban violence, and illicit economies. Perhaps getting into the grey zone there, which we may be talking about a little later as well. The fieldwork and research have covered, amongst others, Afghanistan, South Asia, Burma, Indonesia, the Andean region, Mexico, Morocco, Somalia, and Eastern Africa. So extremely wide geographical knowledge of conflict, obviously. She's a senior advisor to the congressionally mandated Afghanistan Peace Process Study Group. She's the author of multiple papers regarding Afghanistan. The most intriguing title, I think, is A Bridge Too Far, The Unfulfilled Promise and Limitations of China's Involvement in Afghanistan. And bridge spelt B-R-I in capitals, bracket, D-G-E, close capitals. I think touching on one of the most important aspects of what comes next in Afghanistan, obviously, in relation to the Belt and Road Initiative and China. So without further ado, could I just hand over to Roddy Gow, the chairman and founder of the Asia Scotland Institute, just to kick us off. Roddy.
Martin, thank you, and welcome everybody to this extremely timely discussion on the subjects that we have in front of us. I will confess a personal connection here that my second son served twice in Afghanistan with the Scots Guards and survives to tell the tale. He's doing something else now. But of course, the British have been involved with both what was Mesopotamia and Afghanistan for very, very many years. And the lessons learned from history, which none of us read enough, are considerable and seem to have been ignored. But I'm delighted that we're doing this with the Defence and Security Forum. We've been doing a number of events with them. I'm thrilled that Vanda, you're with us as well. We have an ongoing relationship with the very prestigious Brookings Institution. And of course, with Ben, we bring in the IISS, another very distinguished think tank and policy centre, which has its Shangri-La, I think, sessions regularly. So my role is just to welcome you all, to say this is a hugely important topic, and to explain that Ben will speak first. He will be followed by Vanda. There'll be then an intervention from Lady Olga Maitland, and then we hope that we will get a good Q&A going. So Brigadier Ben Barry, without any more ado, we look forward very much to hearing what you have to say. Thank you.
Thanks, Roddy. War's a terrible thing. I had walk-on parts in the wars in Northern Ireland, Bosnia, Iraq and Afghanistan, and it showed me the cost in blood, treasure, and to families. I've attended too many military funerals. I'm sure those of you, probably including some people who have well-earned campaign medals on their chests, you'd all agree with the value of learning painful lessons by taking them on the chin. So you'll forgive me if I'm sometimes outspoken. These two wars are pregnant with lessons for today. For example, there's currently a debate in the UK over the last few months about the relevance of tanks and armoured vehicles. And I'm sure we'll see some announcements on this next Monday when the Defence Command paper is announced. I assess that armoured vehicles had very high utility in Iraq, where US and British armoured divisions were decisive in the regime change. And heavily protected armoured vehicles also helped in stabilisation operations, saved lives, including in the high proportion of fighting that took place in urban areas, including in Baghdad, Basra, Fallujah, and Sadr City. I've sought to explain how the wars took the contours that they did, including battles that deserve wider understanding. I'll say up front that it gives me no pleasure to judge that if any actor won the Iraq war, it was Tehran, who achieved more of their strategic aims than Washington and London. And of all the generals who led troops in Iraq and Afghanistan, I judge the most successful as Iran's General Qasem Soleimani, commander of their Quds force. On current trajectories in Afghanistan, I think the Taliban are more likely to succeed than the Kabul government, the US or NATO. Why is this? Well, throughout my research, I saw inadequate strategic leadership by national leaders and their government's defense ministries and forces chiefs. And contributory factors included weakness in intelligence and understanding, in reconstruction, in political strategies, in military strategies, operational concepts, tactics, and equipment. Plenty of blame to go around. And these weaknesses all provided opportunities that were exploited by insurgents, warlords, organized crime, militias. And there was much blending between those different types of actor. And in both wars, there was much overlap between armed action and local and national politics. I also have a chapter in the book called Learning Under Fire about the considerable difficulties the US and UK had in adapting to both wars. There are plenty of examples that show what the inhibitors to this were and what the success factors are. I conclude the key success factor is for senior leaders to actively encourage and lead adaptation, as demonstrated by the greater success that US Defense Secretary Robert Gates achieved in this role than did Donald Rumsfeld, his predecessor. So I start the story by explaining the experience of US and UK forces in the quarter century before 9/11, including their deliberate neglect of counterinsurgency. I also wonder if their successes in Bosnia and Kosovo created a warm glow of complacency. Now, the campaign immediately after 9/11 that the US rapidly improvised in Afghanistan, combining the CIA, Special Forces, precision bombing, and the armies in being of the Northern Alliance militias, was highly successful and much more quickly than any commentators predicted. And the long-range insertion of US Marines from the Indian Ocean to Kandahar was the most ambitious amphibious operation of recent times. Also successful was the deployment of a British-led multinational force, the International Security Assistance Force, or ISAF, to Kabul. Although subsequent US attacks at Tora Bora and Operation Anaconda were problematic, both operations have hard lessons about air-land coordination between conventional and special forces, for example. It's easy to be wise after the event, but the deployment of a proper, capable Joint Task Force headquarters to Afghanistan would improve the chances of success. Of course, in 2002, for the US and the UK and many of their allies, Afghanistan became an economy of force theatre. Afghanistan, of course, was one of the least developed nations in the world. Its infrastructure had been badly damaged by decades of war. Its human development indices were very low and many more educated people had fled. The international effort in Afghanistan initially had wide international support, but the Iraq War diverted much military intelligence development and diplomatic capability from Afghanistan to Iraq, imposing fatal opportunity costs. Turning to Iraq, a regime change had been thoroughly planned and drew upon well-trained and led modern air-land forces to defeat formerly poorly trained and led, much less modern Iraqi forces. There are plenty of battles to learn from, including a very innovative CIA and special forces operation in Kurdistan that incorporated a parachute brigade and air-landed armor. The decisive point was the US armoured brigade thunder runs into the centre of Baghdad. I also analysed the British attack on Basra, which was successful. It was a smart siege, both the British in Basra and the Americans in Baghdad capturing both cities without flattening them. Post-conflict stabilisation of Iraq descended into chaos as a result of decisions made and not made by President Bush, Secretary Rumsfeld, and Ambassador Bremer, decisions the UK seemed to have little or no influence on, as well as by the disgraceful abuse of prisoners by US and British troops. These problems fatally damaged the legitimacy of the Iraq War, both in Iraq and internationally. And I'm afraid this damage to legitimacy cross-contaminated the international legitimacy of the war in Afghanistan. In Iraq, it took several years for the US to recognize that the ends, ways, and means being employed were inadequate. Adaptations were eventually made, including the 2007 surge, brilliantly led by General Petraeus, that created limited political progress. Progress that was subsequently reversed by Prime Minister Maliki, who, by repressing Iraqi Sunnis, acted as the midwife of ISIS. There's also a chapter on how, through inadequate strategic leadership, the British military came within inches of defeat in Basra. This dented their credibility and confidence, particularly that of the British Army, damage that I think still lingers. My story then switches back to Afghanistan. Of course, the US and its allies wanted to help the country develop beyond the self-imposed near medieval level of the Taliban regime. And the objectives included democracy, rule of law, eliminating the narcotics industry, and improving the inferior status of women. And despite all the difficulties, there has been much progress with this in Afghanistan, particularly in the cities. But after the initial defeat of the Taliban, the international efforts to build Afghan state capacity and to counter the residual Taliban insurgency were inadequately coordinated and resourced. They also clashed with the country's deep-seated tradition of decentralization. I'm afraid this was reinforced by the political weakness of President Hamid Karzai, who had to govern through patronage and accommodations with local strongmen and warlords. And he wasn't the only person doing this. There was cultivation and empowerment of warlords by the CIA and US Special Forces. All this promoted predation on Afghan civilians, malign behavior by local Afghan officials, and civilian casualties from coalition attacks, and inappropriate behavior by international forces and private military companies all further alienated Afghan civilians and acted as recruiting sergeants for the Taliban, helping them to re-establish themselves from Pakistan. and international efforts to reform Afghan governance only had limited effect in the rural areas that the Taliban successfully contested. NATO assumed security leadership for Afghanistan in 2006, but it met unexpectedly heavy opposition from the Taliban, and fighting greatly intensified in southern and eastern Afghanistan, increasing collateral damage and civilian and military casualties. But until 2010, neither NATO nor the US were willing or able to commit enough forces to regain the initiative. There's also a factor that the ferocity of armed opposition in Afghanistan in 2006 was a strategic shock to many of the US's allies. Against opponents who were determined to fight, international forces who couldn't fight or whose governments wouldn't let them fight were of little utility, adding friction, reminding us that combat is the core military capability and that armed forces should be benchmarked against determined and capable enemies. These comments, of course, mainly apply to some European armies. They certainly don't apply to the US Army and the British Army. And I look in my discussion of this second part of the war in Afghanistan at not only how the British got bogged down in Helmand province, but also Operation Medusa, a 2006 Canadian-led brigade attack in Panjwai district of Kandahar province. I also cover the nearly victorious Taliban attacks on small British bases in Helmand in 2006, and similar attacks that are less well known in the UK on isolated US bases in eastern Afghanistan in 2008-2009. Now, these truly were desperate sieges, as desperate, for example, as Rorke's Drift, and the defenders only survived through extensive use of airstrikes. Great bravery and determination was displayed by US and British troops and by Taliban fighters, and this reminds us of the enduring value of morale, leadership, fighting spirit, and training. By 2009, the international intervention in Afghanistan was close to failure. So I assessed President Obama's Afghan surge and the lengthy decision-making process in Washington, DC. I also assessed the problematic transfer of the war to Afghan leadership. And the subsequent weaknesses of the Afghan government and its forces is demonstrated by an account of the 2015 Taliban capture of Kunduz province in the north and the considerable weakening of the government position in Helmand between then and now. That's it. I'll hand over.
Ben, you've been extremely modest. I expected on the bookshelf behind you to see a few copies of your book. So on your behalf, I shall let everyone see what it looks like. It's also extremely weighty, and your comments for a mere 15 minutes are a brief summary of something that is a huge amount more detail in the book, which I'm very glad to say I'm reviewing for Asian Affairs. So I've read it in some depth. I think it'd be nice to ask a question now, because we have a question from someone in the audience, which I think is more suited for you, from one of our audience members called Aguilan. And if I quote, "In your opinion, do you think that Great Britain underestimated the ethnic, cultural, geopolitical, and sectarian complexities in Iraq when deciding to go along with the USA? Was there any strategic planning or only tactical maneuvering pursued by both countries?" And give you time to ponder that. Actually, Aguilan has asked about both countries eventually, so it's a little bit more complex. Did both countries perhaps underestimate the ethnic, cultural, geopolitical, and sectarian complexities in Iraq? And to what extent do you think?
Well, in terms of the direct question, the answer is a resounding yes. That wasn't for lack of expertise. In the US, the State Department had produced a very thorough and detailed study of Iraq and had a lot of good ideas on what it would take to reconstruct it after the war. But of course, the steering wheel for reconstruction of Iraq was grabbed from the State Department by Donald Rumsfeld's Defense Department. The Defense Department had put enormous effort into producing a very effective military plan for the attack on Iraq, but its planning for stabilisation was weak, started too late, and not enough resources were put into it. I think there was also a distinct ingrained feeling in the US and the British military that they would be welcomed as liberators, and the character of the operations would be closer to Kosovo than to this full-scale insurgency and civil war that happened. What you also have in 2004 and 2005 is a degree of denial and optimism bias in the Pentagon, around the table in the US National Security Council, and in the MOD Whitehall and Number 10. That's about as simply as I can put it. But the question posed, the answer is most definitely yes. And it's the same answer if the same question were posed about Afghanistan.
Thank you very much. I think it's interesting that, and you go into this in your book as well, there clearly were officers, senior officers in charge of Iraq, Petraeus, Odiano especially, who learnt on the job a great deal about the country, its people, its culture, its language, its complexities, and turn things around, and several British officers as well. So it's interesting to note this wasn't a complete failure. The professionals on the ground clearly did know that they had to adapt. I think that's well pointed out by you as well. Could I hand over to Vanda? Vanda, it's in an hour we have far too much to cover on two large and complex countries, but I think Ben's talked about where we were and how we got to here. Where do we go next, especially in regard to Afghanistan, which is a problem for the US administration at the moment? Over to you, please.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to have this conversation with Brigadier Barry and with everyone. He provided a very extraordinarily depth overview of 2 decades of military history and analysis in the two countries, as well as started highlighting some of the key lessons. I would focus pretty much on the current decisions that need to be taken with respect to Afghanistan, both for the United States, but also NATO partners. But let me highlight one element of what Brigadier Barry also previewed or spoke about, namely that at the end of the day, the core problem in both theaters and in other efforts where the international community like the United States and Britain have been engaged in stabilization, counterinsurgency, counterterrorism operations, Somalia comes prominently to mind, as well as Libya, is that at the end of the day, what the internationals were least able to affect were the politics and the misgovernance in the countries after the invasion and during the counterinsurgency efforts. And so it was indeed the predatory, rapacious, capricious governance and corrupt that populations encountered in both Iraq, Afghanistan, as well as Somalia and elsewhere, that alienated them from the state sufficiently enough to be willing to tolerate the insurgents, to find the predictable brutality of the Taliban, and for that matter, even ISIS in Sunni parts of Iraq, easier to cope with and to adapt to than the capricious brutality of the government. And those political deficiencies still plague both countries today. We can talk about Iraq in Q&A. I will limit my remarks now to Afghanistan. So where are we in the political and military situation in Afghanistan? Well, the military effort pretty much stalled by about 2015, 2016. At the time, the battlefield was more or less stalled between the Afghan security forces supported by the international community and the Taliban. Since then, however, particularly in the past 3 years and including the current period, the battlefield is no longer stalled. The Taliban is ascendant. It's gaining significant momentum on the battlefield, and Afghan security forces continue to struggle some of the very same deficiencies and problem, very serious deficiencies and problem they had a decade ago. So the strategic learning and unit level learning that Brigadier Barry talked about on the side of British and international forces has not really to a similar degree taken place with respect to the Afghan security forces. There is one element of the forces, the Afghan Special Operations Forces, that are the heftiest, but many other dimensions of the military efforts, from logistics to intelligence, reconnaissance, air force, maintenance, as well as just basic fighting or even defensive holding capacity of the rest of the military and police, continue to struggle very significantly. So during the Trump administration, a decision was made to extricate the United States from Afghanistan. This was not a new realization. It kept repeatedly coming up during the Obama administration as well. And there were several moments when President Obama wanted to liquidate the mission in Afghanistan. And there were several moments why it did not take place, one of which was in 2014, the arrival of ISIS on the doorsteps of Baghdad and the fall of much of Iraq to Afghanistan that stayed President Obama's hand from going simply to embassy level presence with respect to military forces. So the decision comes up again in the Trump administration, and this time the Trump administration does what the United States had not been willing to do up to that point, which is to directly engage in negotiations with the Taliban that would bypass the Afghan government. There have been feelers to negotiate with the Taliban going back to 2008, 2009, and each time the Taliban insisted that it would directly negotiate with the United States and not with the Afghan government. And during those previous many feelers and attempts, the United States insisted that the Taliban had to negotiate with the Afghan government. So the Trump administration makes this major concession with a view to get out of Afghanistan. And a series of negotiations led by Ambassador Zalmay Khalilzad ultimately result in February 2020, a year ago, in a deal between the United States and the Taliban, referred to as the Doha deal. The terms of the agreement, which become essentially terms of US withdrawal for the Taliban, in exchange for the Taliban's willingness to meet US principles objective, namely counterterrorism objective. Now, essentially what the deal established was US withdrawal. It was not a peace deal. There were 4 elements to the agreement, one of which was that the Taliban would promise not to allow terrorist attacks to take place out of the Afghan territory against the United States and its allies. The first point of this agreement that has wide interpretations as to whether it means that the Taliban has to sever links with Al-Qaeda, which the Taliban hasn't done, whether the Taliban merely has to prevent Al-Qaeda active terrorist operations on its territory. What exactly is the interpretation of that is highly contested, and certainly the severing of links has not happened and is very unlikely to happen in my view. But nonetheless, the Taliban principally said it would not engage and it would not allow other terrorist groups from its territory to engage in international terrorist attacks against US allies and the United States. In exchange for that, the United States agreed to withdraw all of its military forces from Afghanistan by May 1st, 2021, a deadline that's rapidly coming up. Now, in the original hopes of those negotiations, there was a belief that the Taliban would also agree to a comprehensive ceasefire, which was to be point number 3, and then to a negotiated deal with the Afghan government, point 4. What happened in Doha was merely promised to reduce violence, which the Taliban did on a temporary basis against the Afghan government, and to refrain from attacks against the United States, which the and NATO bases and NATO partners. And the Taliban has more or less stuck to that element of the deal, not attacking the internationals in Afghanistan. However, has very dramatically been pounding Afghan security forces over the past year, including in the spring period today, even as the Afghan security forces have gone into what they call active defense, really a posture that seizes the entire battlefield momentum to the Taliban. But even so, tens of thousands of Afghans are dying yearly. We are looking at death rates combined between civilians, Taliban, and Afghan security forces of 30, 40,000 Afghans a year, with the levels of casualties steadily increasing year after year, including in just the past year. Now, the negotiations between the Taliban and the Afghan government, which was the fourth element of the Doha deal, became much delayed. And there were all kinds of reasons why they were delayed. But at the end of the day, the Afghan government really hated the Doha deal and has been unwilling, uninterested in negotiating. And the Taliban also came to believe that it was so strong on the battlefield that it could potentially achieve its objective to return to power, even if not in a fully exclusive government like it had in the 1990s, by delaying negotiations or perhaps avoiding them. So by the time the new Biden administration emerged, the Doha intra-Afghan negotiations achieved very minimal progress and were more or less stalled, with both parties, both the Afghan government and the Taliban, essentially uninterested in the negotiations, both waiting to see what the Biden administration would do. The Ghani government, the government of President Ashraf Ghani, the Afghan government, hopes that the Biden administration would walk away from the deal and would commit itself to an open-ended military sustainment in Afghanistan, at least until a good deal was reached. And a good deal by the Afghan government envisions a deal a la Colombia between the Colombian government and the FARC, which essentially grants the FARC amnesty, some DDR processes, some disarmament, demobilization, reintegration support, and minimal number of seats, 5 seats in each chamber, and allows the FARC political party to compete in elections. This is what the Afghan government would very much like, and what it would want the international community to be fighting in Afghanistan for as long as it takes to get to that stage, essentially reversing the battlefield and putting the Taliban on the run, on the defensive. Now, it's not at all clear that this is possible. In my view, it's not possible to achieve those gains, despite some advocacy for that by some in Washington. So what the Biden administration then came to face were the following option: withdraw by May 1, as agreed in Doha, and see the civil war in Afghanistan significantly intensified, the negotiations in Doha remaining moribund, and eventually the Taliban coming to power with great strength, even if in a coalition government. Or alternatively, to violate the May 1 deal and face a prospect of open-ended fighting. Or perhaps what originally then candidate Biden articulated several times, a vision of maintaining in Afghanistan only a very small military force dedicated solely to counterterrorism, to focusing on Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State in Khorasan, the branch of Islamic State in Afghanistan. The latter option, the last option, the limited counterterrorism force, of course, does nothing for the Afghan government that continues to be both corrupt, exclusionary, highly centralized, but also weaker by the day. So a set of very unpalatable options, all of which have also dramatic implications for US allies. So we are about a month and a half away from the May 1 deadline. And it is clear now that it's simply impossible to lift out US forces out of Afghanistan, equipment, contractors, and allies by that time. So it's very unlikely that the Biden administration, which has not yet announced the results of a strategic review, would be able to stick by that May 1st. The only way to do so would be leaving allies behind, upsetting the premise that the United States would not leave its allies in Afghanistan hanging, the jointly in, jointly out line of NATO, as well as contractors having to destroy much equipment. Nonetheless, even if the US does not leave by May 1st, I don't believe that it is very likely that the Biden administration will have an appetite for an open-ended military commitment to Afghanistan to keep propping up the Afghan government. So in the last minute before concluding, I want to speak about the moonshot policy or moonshot initiative that was just unveiled in Washington and has had dramatic ripple effects throughout Afghanistan and the international sphere, the regional dimensions of the Afghanistan effort. That initiative, unveiled by Ambassador Khalilzad 3 weeks ago, essentially pushes the Doha process to a side and instead has announced a new process in which the Afghan government would and the Taliban would agree to an interim government referred to as a peace government, joint government that would conduct administration for some months until there would be new elections. The Afghan government has been very opposed to that effort because it essentially is an end of the Ashraf Ghani government, although finally agreed to go to a conference in Ankara in early April to discuss those terms. We don't yet know what the Taliban's attitude is toward the agreement fully. We know some things, including that the Taliban has wanted for a long time to have an interim government without Ghani and without those associated with Ghani, an interim government in which the Taliban would be a strong or perhaps dominant actor, and which would kick down the road the can of substantive changes to the Afghan political and social dispensation. And this is really at the core of the issue, that the Afghan government and power brokers, politicians associated with it, want to preserve the order as it exists, more or less, and the Taliban wants to fundamentally revise that order, that it comes to power, it becomes the dominant actor, and it changes the political social order. Unlikely to the way it looked in the 1990s, to some extent, it certainly doesn't want the economic collapse. It's very keen to have international support, but certainly in social and political dimensions. The military have currently on the side of the Taliban.
Vanda, thank you. I think, Martin, you're going to bring in Lady Olga Maitland now?
Yes, Roddy, before we bring in Lady Olga Maitland, who has some questions from Defence and Security Forum, perhaps Vanda, could I just quickly ask you a couple of questions from the audience to sort of dovetail into what you were saying about Afghanistan? Firstly, from Zed, who's asked what was the role and effect of Pakistan in Afghanistan during the period, and I think obviously during the period of conflict since the US intervention. But can I just relate that to a second question from Dexter, who's asked, do you think Afghanistan will become more stable if it's splintered into ethnic group nations or regions similar to Yugoslavia? And I put those questions together, obviously, to
Pakistan has,
exactly. Yeah, go on, please.
Well, Pakistan has systematically supported the Taliban. It did so in the 1990s. It continues to provide intelligence, military support to the Taliban. The big difference from the 1990s is that other actors like Russia, China, and Iran have made their own peace with the Taliban as opposed to opposing it in the 1990s. So Iran also supports the Taliban militarily and with intelligence, although not to the same extent as Pakistan, and Russia also does. They all have made essentially the strategic calculus that the Taliban will be a ruling entity in Afghanistan, formally or informally, and that accommodation with the Taliban was better suited to their interests than opposition to the Taliban. The US spent much of the past 2 decades trying to pressure, sweet talk, cajole, bribe, persuade, develop strategic partnership with Pakistan to get Pakistan to sever its support for the Taliban, to stop providing the Taliban with safe havens, and systematically fails and continues to fail to this day. This has been a major distortion, irritant, central point to US-Pakistan relationship. On the ethnic dimensions, while Pakistan is a country that has a state and no national identity, Afghanistan is a country that has a very weak no state and very strong national identities. So Afghans themselves detest the idea of the country being broken up into pieces, at least formally broken up into pieces. There has never been secessionist tendencies in Afghanistan. Any kind of splitting of the country into various new states has always been opposed, both by Pashtuns, by Tajik group as well. But certainly what many Afghans would like to see is devolution of power, with far less centralization and monopolization of power in the art palace.
I think that's beautifully answered. Thank you very much. Two interesting questions. Lady Olga Maitland from the Defence and Security Forum. Olga, would you like to say something, put something to both panelists?
Well, yes, thank you very much indeed. In fact, I thought the presentation by Brigadier Barry, in a sense, tells it all. When you do get foreign interventions in a country, there will always be consequences. And sometimes it can be positive, but other times, frankly, the culture just doesn't work or gel. And I thought that Vanda's reflections about negotiations today also tell his own story. And it makes me remember when America finally left Vietnam, and they said Vietnam would become another communist domino. Well, in a way it did and it didn't. I think that Vanda was probably getting nearer to the point which had been set out earlier by Ben. We have reached a point of some very unpalatable issues. From the West point of view, we would like to see a Kabul government thrive and flourish, but the realities are different. And what seems to be the case is the Taliban are quite wily politicians. They're not just mountain people with guns. They have brought in their alliances. They've built them up quite strongly. And I think in the end of the day, you have to give them that room space and political space, which honestly they merit, unattractive, unpalatable as they are. The fact is, the Kabul government can only sustain what space they have if they're backed by the Americans. I got a feeling, finally, we're going to find some very unpalatable solutions. The Taliban, in the end, will be the dominant force, and they will call the shots. It's not what we would like, but it is a reality. I wonder whether there is a role for the British in their new global strategy to play a role as a mediator, because they're not as, frankly, as controversial as the Americans as mediators. Have we got a role there? I wonder whether we do, but we would have to be much more open-minded. And I think we really will have to accept that Taliban are going to be long-term players. Over to you all.
Shall I respond?
Yes, do, Ben.
Olga, for those of you from outside the UK, the British government produced an integrated review of its security, defence and diplomacy policy yesterday. And there is language in the middle of it about Afghanistan, which basically says we propose to stay the course alongside our allies. The extent the UK has any influence on Kabul or on the Taliban or on Pakistan, and indeed on the US, is probably all very limited. If the UK wanted more influence, it would have to be prepared to join the US in more of its military effort, including UK bombers and UK special forces. And I see no appetite on the UK government. I also think the UK and US's ability to coerce Pakistan to change its behaviour is very limited. I'm part of the IISS South Asia programme, and before COVID, I would go to Islamabad at least once a year. And I think this is partly because of great fear in Washington, DC and London that pressuring the Islamabad government too much might fatally destabilise it and lead to Pakistan's nuclear weapons falling in the hands of malign actors. So although Pakistan has never used its nuclear weapons in anger, it has actually constrained the behaviour of the UK and US, in my view.
Ben, thank you very much for that. I'd just like to lead you on a little bit further, if I could, and we'll come back to Vanda shortly. You mentioned the UK Defence and Foreign Policy Review, the integrated review. Perhaps you could talk a little bit about that in relation to what you detailed in your book, and we'll go back to the military point perhaps rather than foreign policy, although both are obviously intimately connected. So with the lessons learned from both wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, in your professional view, do you think the British Army is preparing to fight the last wars, or is it ready to fight the next war or grey zone conflict, which may be a level below war? What do you see coming out of the integrated review in terms of preparedness and what the military is ready to do next?
Well, I think we're going to be treated to a great deal of detail on this by the Defence Secretary when he stands up at 3:30 on Monday afternoon to announce the contents of the Defence Command paper. What is quite clear is that the Army has done a very thorough effort to try and learn the lessons of Iraq and Afghanistan, and there's no better tutor than failure because of the sense of urgency it gives. And we do see many relevant adaptations, including improving its capability for information operations with the 77th Brigade, which is pretty unique amongst the armies of the world, and also having a force dedicated to capacity building, including capacity building under fire. the Specialist Infantry Group, which is very similar to the US Army's Security Force Assistance Brigades. It's also done a lot of thinking about the shape and character of future war, much of which makes sense to me. My biggest worry about all three UK armed forces is that they're now very, very small. The US Army, for example, doesn't have much more deployable capability than, say, the Australian or Canadian Army. The Navy is rising in strength, but the Royal Air Force is also very small. There are a lot of imaginative ideas about the future character of conflict and the way all three armed forces are going to adapt. They're in something that was published in December called the Integrated Operating Concept. A lot of it makes a lot of sense to us in IISS, though I do wonder whether they've been able to learn as much as they could from the success of their opponents, from the success of Daesh, and also particularly from Iran's success in waging hybrid and proxy war. And that's the thing I'll be looking for when I assess what's announced on Monday.
We'll look forward to your writing and your reviews on that more complex subject as well. Vanda, could we switch back to you with a little bit of a different focus and question? So we've talked about the wars themselves, how they're driven by foreign policy, the interests of various governments involved. Perhaps we could switch back to a question from the audience which really deals with the people. And Nandini has asked, and I quote, to address the problem of the inferior position of women in Afghanistan, what did the US and UK do in terms of resource distribution, education for women and people of Afghanistan, and gender justice? How much resources were spent on social and gender justices, education and shelter specifically? And then going a little bit further, I'm sorry, it's quite a broad question. What happened in Iraq in the context of success and failures conceptualized by the US and UK? And I think that's in relation to resource distribution, education for women, etc. It's a difficult subject, but could you talk a little bit about that, the people themselves who suffered mostly, obviously, from these wars?
Sure. One of the tragedies of the United States facing how to extricate itself from Afghanistan is that the outcome will be very difficult for the Afghan people, particularly for those who live in cities. The Taliban controls much of the countryside, and a lot of the population there lives and has lived under the Taliban's rule. We talked about how different entities, the international military forces, Afghan government, Afghan security forces were able to adapt or not. The Taliban has changed, it has adapted. It is quite adroit in responding to pressure from local communities up to a point. But nonetheless, the Taliban's rule is still very restrictive. One of the big differences compared to the 1990s and even compared to 5 years ago and the so-called uprisings is that the Taliban now allows the delivery of services by the Afghan government and international NGOs in territory that it runs, but it has no capacity itself to deliver those services. We see it very dramatically in the Taliban's response to COVID, for example. It is really in the urban spaces, major urban cities like Jalalabad, Herat, Kandahar, Kunduz, Bahlan, that the population has been most removed from the Taliban and where it experienced more economic, educational, social progress and greater civil liberties and freedoms. If the Taliban is going to return to power, even a shared power, a lot of those freedoms will be curtailed. And this will be dramatically felt by women in urban spaces. For women in rural spaces, however, it is often far more important to have the war end. Their existence already doesn't feature the same liberties, even if they now have more access to education, at least until puberty, and even if they now have better access to medical care than they did in the 1990s. But their lives tend to be still completely dominated by male relatives, husbands, fathers, or if both don't exist, other male relatives. And when they are lost, when the male relatives are lost to the war, that severely affects their ability to access healthcare, jobs, income, and even minimal education. So there's a big division in preferences of urban women who want the United States to stay and fight, who don't want a peace deal with the Taliban that would change their human rights and civil liberties, and many urban women for whom simply ending the fighting and the loss of males is the priority. The United States and the international communities will have more limited capacity to influence this, particularly if and when the United States withdraws military forces. But even in the absence of US role on the battlefield, it doesn't mean we have no leverage on the Taliban. The Taliban wants international legitimacy and it wants international funding, even when it is in government. It understands that. And so how we calibrate, condition international aid and support to the Taliban, upholding at least some core aspects of civil rights, human rights, and rights for women is something where the negotiations and diplomatic efforts need to focus on.
Thank you very much. That's tremendous insight, I think, to what may seem when we pose it a simple question, but there's this huge complexity between rural and urban areas in Afghanistan, obviously Kabul and the rest. Could I just ask a long-term member of Asia Scotland Institute, Sunil Shastri has a question. Sunil, would you like to come on, please?
Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Roddy. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you also, Barry, Vanda, and Olga. I just want to start with the title of the talk and the title of the book. And you talk of victory turned into defeat. And I want to contend that right from the start, it was more about how to make the defeat less painful than about victory. And I just want to say that, you know, there was no local concern in the entire business, both in Afghanistan and Iraq. And Lady Olga actually mentioned Vietnam. And I've been watching this great, I call it educational documentary, The Vietnam War, by the celebrated filmmaker Ken Burns. And there, a quote sticks in my mind by General Sam Wilson. And he says, "We are prisoners of our own experience. And many of the things that we learned from World War II were not applicable to the war in Vietnam. We simply thought that we would go there with a sledgehammer, knock things down, clean them up, and that would be over." And that just reflects Afghanistan and Iraq. And he says, he ends very poignantly, and he says, "It is very, very difficult to dispel ignorance if you retain arrogance." So my question is, when will the West ever learn? You know, and Britain now wants to have more nuclear warheads. So, I mean, when are we going to learn at all from these lessons ever, if ever? Thank you.
Shall I go on that? I mean, Sunil, I too was outraged to see so many of the mistakes the US made depicted in the Ken Burns documentary and also in Max Hastings' excellent history of the war, repeated for Iraq and Afghanistan. There is a factor which isn't covered in either of those, is after both wars, the US Army and US Air Force basically said to themselves, we don't want to do any more of that again. They concentrated on modernizing themselves to fight World War III against Russia, and walked away from counterinsurgency. It wasn't even taught as a mainstream subject. The US Marines and US Special Forces kept it alive to a certain extent. And that was one of the factors that led to many of the early mistakes in 2004, 2005, before a lot of excellent officers, including, for example, then Colonel H.R. McMaster and Colonel Sean McFarland, educated themselves in counterinsurgency. The same also applied to the British. I think in both countries and both defense establishments, Iraq and Afghanistan was a very humbling experience in all sorts of ways that slightly dented their strategic self-confidence. Quite clearly, there's a desire not to try and repeat similar operations. But in the case of the British, they're talking about doing more partnering with local allies, countries that are threatened by non-state armed groups. Well, we'll see how that goes. But I think what both armed forces have learned is the value of understanding and drawing fully on the understanding that's available, particularly in intelligence agencies and diplomats, before they get involved in new countries. My final point is, when I was doing the British Army's Iraq lessons, quite a few of the more thoughtful British officers said to me words to the effect of, well, look, Ben, looking back on this, I realized that when we were looking at what we needed to do and planning, we often started from a British point of view and came up with an outcome that would suit us. We only added on the Iraqi point of view as an afterthought. What we should do next time is start from the host nation's point of view.
Absolutely right.
Thank you very much, Ben. I'd like to give Vanda the final word, if I could, before we hand back to Roddy to close. Vanda, because obviously we're talking about what comes next. How confident are you about what comes next? You've talked in a great deal of detail about what could happen. How confident are you of stabilisation in Afghanistan?
Well, we are all waiting to see how the Biden administration will conclude its strategic review and what kind of judgments it will make, how long to stay in Afghanistan with any kind of military force or not. Regardless of the decisions, the security situation, in my view, will continue to deteriorate. The question is, how long is the US willing to keep the patient on life support? And what kind of arrangement is reached? How much civil war and more bloodshed is lost there before, in my view, inevitably the Taliban comes to power? How much of a power it will have? And the extent to which the international community develops a capacity to shape the Taliban's behavior once it is in power and as it is coming to power. That, to me, is the strategic fulcrum. But that is the defeat that many have not accepted yet. Certainly many in Washington, but also very many European allies who still consider the notion of profound changes to the political and social dispensation absolutely unacceptable and something that is not politically tolerable for them as well. My concluding comment, though, is the one that I started with, which is our challenge in operations in Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, in how we look forward at building alliances to counter non-state armed actors or counter the behavior of China, perhaps increasingly Russia in various parts of the world, is not, the weakness of that is not so much the enemy. It's not the Taliban, the Shabab. The greatest challenge is the partners. The governments of those countries, the various political power brokers in those countries, whose interests are aligned with our interests for only a moment of time. And rather than being two parallel lines, even through our training, are essentially two lines that intersect but start diverging. And that is the Gordian knot of the stabilization, counterinsurgency, counterterrorism efforts that we have not been able to resolve. With partners like these, who needs enemies?
Thank you very much, Vanda, for that insight. Thank you very much, Ben, for talking through both wars, the situations, and what comes next. Could I hand back to Roddy, please, just to close us out? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And thank you very much to our panelists for a fascinating hour together with you. There are a couple of quick points I'd like to make. First of all, the Asia Scotland Institute, our mission is to increase understanding of a region that extends from Syria in the west to Japan in the east, and of course, Central Asia, Southern Caucasus. And that means getting into the weeds of the discussions we've been talking about and looking at the tensions in these places. So this is very much at the center of what we want to do. And I'm delighted that we've been able to do this with the Defense and Security Forum, because defense and security issues are now permeating so many of the things that happen in Pan-Asia. A couple of points I wanted to make quickly was that, Vanda, your comments about who we ally with and who we work with. I have a feeling that in Afghanistan, nothing will ever get solved unless we bring in the neighbors of Afghanistan, all of whom have a vested interest, I hope, at the end of the day, in some sort of stability. We'll see, but I agree with your assessment, and it'll be very interesting to see what the Biden administration does. And Ben, your comments were fascinating too, as an ex-military man myself, although I was, I suppose, mainly Northern Ireland and Northwest Europe. But you said something which was fascinating to me. It reminded me of what people in the consumer industry say. Don't tell the customer what the customer wants. Ask the customer, what the customer wants. So dealing with the host nation to understand the outcomes that they're looking for and building that into our military planning and strategy. Very, very interesting. But you've left us, all of you, with all sorts of thoughts to think about. And as I say, until we meet again, it's been wonderful having these 1, 2, 3, 4 talking heads educating us today. And on behalf of the Asia Scotland Institute, thank you to its home team, Martin and Andrew, for making this happen. Thank you to all the people listening and that are still there. And we look forward to when we get together the next time, which I think is on the subject of India, and it's next week. So to everybody, thanks.